there's no daylight between the protection of our democracy and the protection of anti-racism. It's not just the mobilization of the right wing, but the silence about it, the inability to talk about it. I mean, we have seen for months that Confederate flag and the gallows in the news, but mainstream media had a hard time actually saying we have a white supremacist problem, partly because we've not talked critically about race for the last several decades. So here you have a moment where the weakness, the lack of framing, the inability to call out racism and to analyze it has actually brought our democracy to the brink. We cannot afford colorblindness in talking about the most significant threat to our democracy that we've seen in our lifetimes.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Glad to have you here with us this evening. As you are coming in and starting, we wanted to share some wisdom from none other than Kimberly Crenshaw. That's who that was in that video. If you don't know who she is, you should definitely look her up. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Tamika Hobbs, and I'm the board chair of the South Florida People of Color. The South Florida People of Color is a nonprofit organization committed to racial healing and dismantling racism in all its forms, individual, institutional, and systemic, through education, dialogue, and advocacy across racial and ethnic divides. I've been with the organization since it was founded in 2015 in the roles of curriculum designer, facilitator, and chief strategist. During that time, I've shared with our participants my concerns about the increasing frequency of racial dog whistles in American political life. More specifically, I've been concerned about how effective those calls have been and the vitriol and violence they have encouraged in our nation. As a historian of racial violence in America's past, it has concerned me that the arc of our national fate seems to has stopped swinging in the direction of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and instead towards white nationalism, white supremacy, and a return to the subordination of people based on race, gender identity, and sexual identity. We've been down that path before here in America, and it is not pretty. Over these past few years, we have all seen the evidence of this change. The most telling sign is an increase in racial violence. We've seen mass shootings of Black people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and in a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, by white gunmen influenced by white nationalist rhetoric. During the pandemic, we've seen attacks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We've seen members of the Jewish faith community targeted by gunmen. Unfortunately, that list goes on and on and on. More recently, we've seen a new form of violence, political violence. I take that term from historian Carol Anderson, who in her book, White Rage, lays out the historical pattern of both physical violence, which is easy to identify, and policy violence, the use of the legal system to create or maintain economic, social, and political dominance over a subordinate group, which can appear colorblind to the untrained eye. Here in the state of Florida, we have seen leaders use their power to enact policy violence that is actively marginalizing discussions about race and equity in our classrooms and workplaces, that are marginalizing LGBTQ youth and educators, violent policies that are stripping women of their medical autonomy. That list goes on and on. The South Florida People of Color was inspired to put this forum on tonight as an expression of our work to shine a light on racism wherever it exists. We also recognize that no major movement for equity or progress in this country has taken place without allyship. And while we have talked to hundreds of participants and trainees over the years as a part of our Unity 360 race dialogues, or a part of our Unity 360 Institute sessions, or across the dinner table during our awkward dinners about the need for allyship, we acknowledge that this is a critical season for us to engage our allies and to call for active anti-racism. In the fight to create a society where institutional and systemic racism no longer exist, every action by every citizen either moves us toward or away from an equitable society. This includes the way we vote. With that in mind, we are issuing a call for active anti-racism and anti-bias at the ballot box this election season. The way you cast your ballot is either creating opportunity for all or doing real, tangible harm to systemically and historically marginalized people. That is what brings us here tonight, and I'm very excited about this discussion. We've invited some friends who happen to be experts and who've been fighting for justice in this state for years, and they've come to engage us tonight. So I want to thank our audience for being here, and just to let you know you're going to be in for a very powerful discussion. I also want you to know that we are interested in your thoughts and opinions and questions. So I'm going to invite you now and throughout our sessions this evening to use the chat in whatever platform you happen to be engaging. And we will work to integrate your comments and questions into the discussion as we go along tonight. With that, I am going to turn it over to Ronnie Bennett. Ronnie Bennett is the founder and executive director of the South Florida People of Color. Ronnie?
Okay, thank you. I had to unmute. Okay, so, my name is Ronnie Bennett, and I just wanted to thank everyone for participating in our event tonight. And it looks like Dr. Tamika Hobbs already said all what, I don't know what else to say at this point, but I would like to say one more thing, which is, I do like to do a land acknowledgement that we are having this, events on the unceded land of the Tequesta, the Seminole, and the Jago First Nation people. And so this is their land, but it was founded by the U.S., but it was founded upon exclusion and erasure of many of the indigenous people. So I just wanted to uplift that. And Dr. Tamika Hall also, told you about South Florida People of Color. And so I'm just kind of excited to be here and to be with these great panelists. So I'll give it back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Ronnie. And thank you for your vision and your leadership as always. I would like to move next to introduce our panelists. Ronnie Bennett is going to be one of them, so she'll be with us tonight. I'd like to welcome Senator Dwight Bullard with Florida Rising, and Carrie Fee, who's with Women March Florida. And a little later, we will be joined by Cecile Schoon with the League of Women Voters of Florida. We're really thrilled that they agreed to share their time and, most importantly, their critical perspectives and experiences this evening. I would also like to recognize Florida Rising for their support of this program and making it happen tonight. Really appreciate the work that they do here in the state and for their support of this program. So with that, I'd like to really take an opportunity and level set for our panelists tonight. Our call for anti-racist allyship at the ballot box is an attempt to highlight a political culture in this country that has become undeniably more racist and more biased over the last several years. I would like to ask our panelists how they have seen this crisis evolve over the years, and how would you frame your particular perspective on this issue? And I'd like to come to Carrie first. Carrie, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think what I've seen just over the past few years, and Dwight's been in this work, and you all probably have longer than I have, but I think the major difference is that, of course, we've always had differing political beliefs, and different side of the aisles feeling about, different ideas about how to effectuate, better societies and better communities. But I think what we're seeing, especially in the last few years, is really policy taking form of just culture wars, right? We have, literally culture war legislation that's being filed, not just in Florida, but it's, nationally driven, and Florida then leads the charge, as you all know. But, this legislation that doesn't necessarily, is vaguely worded, doesn't necessarily do anything. It won't necessarily even be able to be enforced, but it's just an intimidation factor. It's just a way to gain political points, right? It's legislation for political gain, right? And it of course starts seeking political gain, but then the result is really it creates fear and hate, because it does convince those folks that are vulnerable to following those politics. It does make them scared of others, right? The white race being disappeared, or their kids turning gay, or their kids feeling bad in school for having white skin, and all of these things that they sort of fall to. And the other big difference is this this grave departure from democracy, right? I mean, we've had valid political beliefs on both sides, but I don't think we've seen this sort of this idea of this, and it's funny because the side that traditionally stood for law and order and patriotism is now really just throwing that all away, and we're seem to be heading something towards something akin to fascism or authoritarianism. And of course, it all goes back to, it's out of desperation, right? These desperate moves, and it all goes, I think, back to this fear of the loss of the white race. It's all tied back to white supremacy and, of course, exploitative capitalism, which are so interconnected, which really honestly brings us back to the full circle to say, this really isn't new, right? Because white supremacy always reigned. But I think because of the way that our country is maybe looking different, because of our country maybe being more multicultural, now the measures taken are more desperate and more extreme, right?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. You really are hinting at this idea of replacement theory, which has been a motivating factor for justification for some of the violence that we've been seeing. Very dangerous ideology. Dwight, I'm going to come to you. How would you respond? How have you been thinking and reacting to what's there?
Yeah, piggybacking on what Carrie was sharing, just to kind of level set for folks, we have to understand that the dominant culture, the dominant narrative for the bulk of our time as a country here in the US has been one that has been rooted in white cisgendered male dominance, right? I mean, this notion of founding fathers, this notion of, kind of like political intelligentsia kind of sitting with or resting with the likes of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, or the people who appear on Mount Rushmore. You know what I mean? Like that's been the dominant talking point for so long that people become accustomed to that as fact, even though we know it was not the case, right? That there were and always have been people of color, people of varying gender identities who've always been in the background or oftentimes in the forefront, but washed away in terms of making significant change and strides here in this country. And so now we're at a point where people are, and very, to their credit, in a very militant way, kind of saying enough is enough. We want our representation. We want folks to recognize our accomplishments, the things that we've had, to tell a historical narrative that is rooted in actual fact, as opposed to this kind of like notion of heroism or violence that has been viewed as manifest destiny or any other of the romanticized terms that we become accustomed to, and for some people that freaks them out. The fact that they grew up watching the valiant cowboy kill the indigenous person. And that was just the way it was supposed to be. And so there's now this sort of pushback and people trying to correct back to that thing. And what we have to do, if we're going to talk about honest allyship, we have to understand that it is very much righteous, very much in the right mindset to allow people who've always been here, who have been around, who have contributed to the growth and the betterment of this society, getting their just due, and having a level of representation. in this space. You know, whether it's the Voting Rights Act or the Civil Rights Act, whether it is the Americans with Disabilities Act, whether it is Title IX, these are all important pieces of legislation at the federal level that have been put in place to make sure that people who historically have not had access get a chance to have access, and people, you know, need to understand that that's a good thing, and that history tells us that things like the Indian Removal Act or the Chinese Exclusion Act, which were also federal policies, should not have been passed, and as a matter of fact, should have been stricken from the law and should be rooted out of the law, in order to make sure that all of us who reside in this space get our fair share of what is the supposed American experience.
Thank you for that. And I should have known, I was counting on you to kind of open the door to this part of the conversation and help people to understand the connection between the history we learn and our relationship to our government. Because, you know, to your point, even having the ability to learn about all of the legislation that you laid out, I didn't get that opportunity until I was at college, and I happened to make a wonderful choice to attend a historically Black university at Florida A&M, and that was groundbreaking and life-changing. And even as a 19-year-old, I was outraged that someone made choices about a curriculum that I didn't need to learn these things, to exclude those things. And what's really frightening for me, both personally and professionally as a historian, is to live through a period where we were making some tangible process towards diversifying the curriculum, decolonizing the curriculum. And now we have things like HB 7 and the civics curriculum, excellence curriculum that has been put in place by the governor and the Commissioner of Education that is highly problematic. Can we talk a little bit about this interplay between bad history, accurate history, and the embrace of diversity and equity in our society?
Yeah, I mean, let's start by saying, talking about the elephant in the room, and that is that the history of this country, as it's been laid out for most of us through the American education system, has been haphazard at best, and just outright dangerous at worst, right? Because it is a very much whitewashed, pun intended, telling and romanticizing of what has been a very, very violent history in this country, in which individuals who have been historically marginalized get left out, not only of the telling of the story, but of their contribution, whether it be to the violence or to the disadvantage of being oppressed, right? And so when we're talking about an accurate telling of history, let's go ahead and speak truth to power. Yes, everyone's like, well, we should we feel bad or make people feel bad? Listen, at the end of the day, we all bear a collective responsibility for the damage that we've caused. And we talk about policy, and I don't want to go too far, down the rabbit hole, but we're talking about, whether it is what we've done to our rivers and streams via environmentalism, what we've done to deforest and chop down trees in this country to our own detriment in terms of the air that we breathe. All of that really has come to bear in this moment. And in order for us to autocorrect, we have to start first with the telling of a level of truth about the history of this country. And so the interplay, as you brought up with things like HB 7 and even HB 5057, which is the Don't Say Gay bill, is this notion that government now wants to go back to this idea of, let's tell a very romanticized, America's the greatest thing that ever happened since apple pie kind of historical telling that, again, does not talk about the violence of it, of wiping out indigenous populations, that, again, does not talk about the use of forced labor and slave labor in this country for longer than we have not had forced labor or slave labor. Like that, just that simple fact is hard for people to understand, that we have, lived in a country that has had slavery longer than it has had slave notions, right? And if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we're still talking about the use of incarcerated individuals as labor. We still didn't have enslaved labor, right? And but we have to be honest about the telling of that in order to come up with better policy, right? That again starts to address the issue of climate change, that starts to address issues of pollution, deforestation, and the like. But also, we have to talk about a true telling of history in order to allow people to holistically exist in a space as themselves, right?
Agreed.
As they present themselves. And so
I would add to that list lynching. As a lynching scholar, I am constantly surprised that when I'm delivering talks about my work to people, that it's new information for them. And it was a terroristic regime that African Americans lived with in this country for a century. And here in the state of Florida, it was outsized. Black folks living in the state of Florida had the highest likelihood of being lynched of any people in the United States. That's a statistical fact, but so many Floridians don't know that. I'm also reminded in listening to you about a very important reminder for all of us about the lost cause, is what we call it in the field of history, but the romanticization of the Confederates and the Confederate States of America was allowed to dominate the landscape. It was allowed to dominate the curriculum. It was something that uplifted people who were essentially traitors, started a war against the United States of America. It, it deified them with statues all across the region and even the nation. And it also, on the other hand, is something that I see in this civics literacy excellence initiative that's been started here in the state of Florida, which is it romanticized slavery. That slavery wasn't so bad, that enslaved people were, not so unhappy. We have heard the headlines about out in Texas, them deciding to refer to slavery as involuntary migration. What does that do to a child? I want to make some room here for Ronnie to come in, and because while we're talking about this, and we can come back to it in the K-12 and K-20 environment, Ronnie, what have you seen in terms of what this Stop Woke, the wrongs against our kids and employees is what that stands for. How has that played out for you as a leader of an anti-racist educational operation?
Yeah, so as you know, we do DEI training for organizations, right? And it has a chilling effect on it. People are not really saying anything, but we're not getting, things are put on hold, or they want to wait to see what happens. So yeah, it's an effect on their bottom line. But if you really think about it, we're talking about businesses here. That bill says that it's more of a personal. Someone has to sue you. So I really can't see an employee wanting to sue their employer because they were feeling bad in a DEI. But they may, especially if they're leaving. So yeah, it has a tremendous effect on our bottom line. And also, what's even more important, DEI, you need that, people have, at least from a diversity and inclusion perspective, has become a lot more equitable and, more representation, but, we'll see how that goes,
Yeah, I think on so many levels, that's part of the problem with the legislation, right? Is that it's attempting to legislate emotion, making someone feel uncomfortable when it does not take into consideration what it feels like to be discriminated or to have microaggressions committed against you in your workplace or in your educational environment. And that's part of a term I'll come to, and maybe we'll talk a bit about it in a little bit, of the dog whistle. In so much of this, from the name of HB7 as Stop Woke, to, you know, even the this return to, and you hear it frequently, this refrain of parents' rights. There are things that are inferred in between the lines that really speak to certain groups, and it presses what Carrie said earlier, this feeling that we're losing, and because we're losing, we're justified in fighting back, which is all a false narrative. I want to pivot here and bring Carrie into the conversation, because as we talked about, this political violence against groups that have been systemically and historically marginalized, like queer people, like African Americans, we can see that very clear in the Stop Woke and Don't Say Gay, but it also has begun to creep out into a lot of censorship, attempts at book banning. And Carrie, you just led, I was so proud of you to see that playing out, pushback against the Miami-Dade County public school system in an attempt to quiet even sex education. Why was that controversial, and what happened in that fight?
Yeah, you know, we talk about some of this legislation is sort of vague, and we worry more about the chilling effect and how it's going to be misinterpreted, and how it is being, bad guidance is being given from some districts and schools. But then we have some more tangible legislation that's actually created some real terrible influences on our education, like HB 1467, which is where this really instructional material parental involvement has come from. And, you know, every, PTA, which I'm also involved with, and every group that involves parents will tell you, we're all for parental involvement. That's not the problem. But when we are talking about science and truth and life-saving information, we do need the experts and the school staff that have the expertise and who've selected these materials with care over years. We do need to rely on them. This parents' rights movement is really, again, rooted really in transphobia, homophobia, white supremacy. It's just an extension in Florida, certainly, of our governor. There's very thick relationships between Moms for Liberty example and our governor. But yeah, so what happened in the Miami-Dade School Board level is that there were now, because of 1467, if there are not state approved textbooks, they do have to be approved county-wide. So Miami-Dade County was selecting new sex ed textbooks. There was a hearing, there was an approval process by our school board. And at first they approved the materials. There was some pushback by some more conservative board members about some of the graphics that really were of no real concern, but there was some pushback. But ultimately, and again, largely because of the opt-out, for the ability for parents to opt out, the textbooks initially were approved. Then after that, and I was at that school board meeting with only, because that item was heard not until midnight, and so it was only a few of us. It happened to be the few of us that were arguing for inclusion of the textbooks, and it almost seemed like they weren't going to be approved. But when we made those arguments about, what about the rights of parents that desperately need their kids to learn life-saving, sex education information, especially with the increase in predators and human trafficking, and just the importance of understanding the ideas around consent and body autonomy and what a healthy relationship looks like, right? So a lot of us parents feel that we desperately rely on that information in schools. I have the conversations with my children, but in the back of my mind, I'm saying, well, thank God they're also learning this fully and comprehensively and accurately from their educators and from the experts, right? So we showed up and we expressed that, and largely because we were really the only parents who showed up, they were approved. Well, because of 1467, there's now the ability for petitions. Parents, and I don't even think it has to be parents, but anyone really can object to these textbooks or to any curriculum. And it was about like 300 objections, only 40 of which were parents. They had another hearing. It wasn't, a regular school board meeting, but it was a hearing in which I think only 3 of those 40 parents even showed up. And per statute, an independent and unbiased hearing officer hears the petitions and decides if the objections are valid. And that hearing officer recommended that the objections were not valid, and that the school board should just go ahead with their adoption of these textbooks. And so the next school board meeting, that was supposed to happen. It was simply the item was simply to accept the recommendations of this officer, which again, this is how it was set out in statute. Here's where we start coming away from like trusting our local governments, trusting our school board, law and order. And there was just this unexpected uprising by a few school board members. And they did not accept the opinions of the hearing officer, and these textbooks were not approved, which the result was, which was so egregious, is that Miami-Dade County would not have sex ed curriculum, would not have health and sex education textbooks for the fall. And that directly impacts my kids who are at the very tender ages of needing that information. And so not only was it ignoring the fact that parents could opt out, it was ignoring the fact that these minority of parents were making hay about this. With no valid, just based on all conspiracy theories and bringing up the information that was in these textbooks about gender and sexuality, which by the way had already been pulled because of HB 1557. So that wasn't even in there. So there was just a lot of misinformation by a minority of parents, but they were successful in getting the school board to vote down these textbooks. And again, they would now not be
being able to turn that around, correct?
Right, and they would now not be in compliance with the Department of with the Florida state mandated curriculum. So with all of those reasons, over the next board meeting, yes, we were able to put out a petition, a bunch of parents, just a handful of parents, including myself. We got like almost 8,000 signatures, and not that wasn't the only reason, obviously, but that was one of the efforts that was brought forth. And the next school board meeting, because of a few different reasons, they did ultimately approve these textbooks. So that was a very tangible win, and we don't get a lot of those, so it was a good thing. But that's just, we don't know what's going to happen going forward. But for now, Miami-Dade County students have sex ed for right now.
Well, I want to thank you for your leadership and championing that. And those wins are precious. I was cheering from up here in Jacksonville for that victory. But you bring up a couple of things that I think is important to uplift for our audience, because our goal is really to empower people to be better able to address these issues in their daily conversations with family members and colleagues and friends. There are patterns here that if you pay attention to are very important. And one of the things that we're seeing with this 1467, right? And in this, and as I said before, this argument for parents' rights, it's a continued erosion of the value of experts. We saw it during the pandemic and the attacks, baseless attacks on Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is a public health official, who is well-educated, well-experienced, and charged with guiding our nation through a very difficult period, but he is attacked. You now see this coming into the educational arena, where the experts who are our teachers, who have been trained, to come into the classrooms and deliver, not just on the classroom management, but pedagogy and subject matter, they are now being challenged. And then the last piece I'll mention, because we need to get into this at some point, is that you have the equivalent of the Proud Boys and what they've done to the Miami-Dade Republican Party with the Moms for Liberty. They're basically the Proud Girls. And that is a tactic to show up loud, to show up in numbers. And I want to make sure that our audience understands that that is a part of that political violence that I referenced with Carol Anderson, when people who have been empowered systemically use their power now to try to stop forward progress and prevent other people from being able to lead, you have a real problem. And I think one of the questions that I have coming to my mind or statement is that if you only believe in democracy when white people are in charge, like we really need to have that conversation. But I think that there's a lot that's going on that is bringing to the fore some of these deep-seated, we call them in our practice, implicit racial bias. But that's why you do the work, is so people can dig this stuff out of their consciousness and begin to wrestle with it. I'm going to pause here before we go on and just welcome our next panelist, Cecile Schoons. Ms. Schoon, thank you so much for your willingness to be here. We're glad to have you as a part of the discussion, but we've been having a good time and are eager to have you jump in. But Dwight, did you want to say something? You look like you were kind of chomping to get at the bit there as we were going back and forth.
Oh no, I was just in full agreement in the sense that since we're centering this conversation around allyship, I think a lot of people have become very comfortable and feeling as though, the exercise of quote unquote the right vote or kind of kitchen table advocacy is enough, right? And what I would just want to remind folks is that what you were talking about, Dr. Hobbs, is these folks are out here actively being loud, actively creating, stirring up, as you pointed out, political violence in going into these spaces and advocating for their policies. And because they are loud, because they are boisterous, are getting these wins that are undermining the very freedoms that folks have fought so hard for. So I just, for the folks on the call who are viewing in, it is more than just kind of sitting back and hoping for the best, or as people have become very complacent in doing, kind of like, I'll send a tweet out, or, I'll make a Facebook post, and kind of, that'll be the extent of my advocacy. When you have folks driving 4, 5, 8 hours from their homes to come to Miami-Dade, to get inside the school board meeting to say that my child, even though they don't have a child, or don't have a child in Miami-Dade County, is being impacted by the policies in Miami-Dade, and the very people who live in Miami-Dade, won't make that same, use that same energy. We have an imbalance and we have a problem. And then when the policy gets passed, people are like awestruck, are amazed by the fact that these things happen. I mean, we have so many adages: squeaky wheel gets the oil, closed mouths don't get fed, like all these things that have been said for centuries, really, about how advocacy should work. And people have just become complicit, by their silence. And so I just want to encourage folks that it goes beyond listening here. Yeah, we can give you all the tools in the toolbox, but if you're not willing to break out the hammer and the screwdriver to fix this thing, we got a serious problem.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, it's really important. We will be getting to some calls for action. We have developed some as a part of this anti-racist allyship at the ballot box campaign that we're initiating. We have some critical questions that we think that everyone needs to be asking themselves about policies and candidates before they go to the ballot box, to really consider the lens of allyship, of anti-racism and anti-bias. And, I'm struck by the fact that, it continues to be folks who have been marginalized, whose voices often aren't listened to. But we know, and I feel doubly burdened in some ways, maybe triply, as a woman, as a person of African descent, and as a historian. Like you feel it, you live through it, and then because I've studied it, you can discern these very concerning patterns, and you just want to shake people up and move them to activism. And to your point, Dwight, like we can't. If we relax in this moment in our country, I think these next 2 election cycles, we will wake up and won't recognize the country in which we live. And that's going to give me the pivot I've been waiting to make, because going back to Kimberly Crenshaw's video at the beginning, she lays out very clearly and very articulately the connection between the forces of racism and the way that they are rising in our country right now, and the threat that it represents to our democracy. And some of this has taken a front seat because of the hearings, the congressional hearings, into what happened on January the 6th. I wonder, maybe, Cecile, if you would be interested in sharing with the audience. I'm also going to put in the chat a very interesting article from the New York Times for our listeners. But what would you say? You're muted right now. There you go.
Yes, thank you. I mean, there's been so much that's been touched on. I just turned 63 yesterday, and thank you. I think my generation of, I would say, formally educated African Americans benefited directly and in heavily by the work of many people who themselves never got those educations. Many Black folk in the South and risked their lives. Some of them, were injured, jailed, lost their jobs. I mean, we know the stories. But what ended up happening is many of us that got all the opportunities and immigration and all these other things, we were not really taught in a consistent manner that we needed to continue the work. And I think our whole community, basically, we're coming to this more recent, I guess I would call it a fight for the votes. We're coming, like we've been woken up from a deep sleep. I think people are waking up, but I think that that's created a little bit of a lag. And in addition to that, I see that many of ourselves and even our youth, they don't always value the vote because things are fine, right? I mean, my parents' generation, they saw it all. Literally, no Blacks come in here, come in the back. You couldn't travel safely across the nation. They lived it. My generation, right under the wire, all the opportunities were available to me. And then my children, what have I shown them? So I think there's this false feeling that voting has nothing to do with staying well and having your community's needs being met. And it's our job to tie the connection. I'll give an example. I was doing it with my sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, but got my pearls, my pink. But we were working with the League of Women Voters of Florida, and we were doing voter registration at a Good Start program for children for education, little ones. And there were so many young people coming in looking dressed and well groomed and their children. And I thought, would you like to register to vote? It doesn't have anything to do with me. Politics is dirty. They're all the same. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. I am nonpartisan and I'm representing nonpartisan. But did you know that this building, this Head Start building that you love and the system, that are you children getting good service? Yes. You're not paying market rate. Politicians that people voted for determined that this national program would be available and you're being subsidized. You're paying about 25% of the market rate. So people that vote, that we vote on, decided that. Oh, let me register. So we need to bring that to them. Oh, do you have a grandmother who needs her meds? Yes, yeah, we try to help her with her meds. Do you know that people that you vote for decide what medicines and what kind of coverage? We just gotta take those little steps to reconnect people to understand that everything around us is basically determined by a vote. So that's my experience as a league president, and coming up through the I would say through the system in the league, as I still work on the street, I still do my voter registration and these kinds of conversations. Well, so we have people kind of not taking their voting as seriously as they should and their civic engagement as they should, right? At the same time that you sort of have a softening of this vigor, then you have, as Mr. Dwight mentioned, you have all, and Ms. Carey mentioned, you have all this energy to push it down and harm you even further. And that energy has found its way into legislation that has been very harmful. And I don't know if you want me to mention the legislation at this time, but there's been continuing laws that have limited the right to vote have made it more difficult to vote, more difficult to register voters. And as Judge Walker said, a federal judge, he said in his final order, I think it was over 200 pages, his final order on the Senate Bill 90 voting restrictions, he said that the last 20 years, when he examined all of the evidence, that at the then Republican legislators had intentionally passed legislation that would target the way African Americans and brown people vote. Because whatever way they voted, they would limit that, whether it be early voting, souls to the polls, Amendment 4, Senate Bill 90, and now they put limitations on third-party voter organizations such as the League and the NAACP, knowing that African Americans rely more heavily on those third-party voter registrations. So it's a pretty serious matter. And so it's not going to work for our communities to ignore that. And we truly need the allyship of good citizens, regardless of their race, to get involved and for us all to make sure that not only are our voting rights protected, but our educational rights for our children, their health rights, and certainly a woman's right to choose. All of these things are being narrowed and limited, and they're all related to a vote. So that's the message that we need to take forward.
Absolutely. I think thank you for that perspective and for your advocacy, in so many ways with the League of Women Voters. And you do something that's really important. I did want to talk a little bit more about January 6th, but in talking about voting rights and the controversy over that actually is one of the root issues from which January 6th stems. And I always come back to the history, and you mentioned it, Ms. Schoon, that, for some folks, they've had the benefit of living through that. There are those of us who've studied it. And it's unfortunate sometimes that people have to touch the flame or feel the heat to know that it's hot. I think that it really, for a lot of us, provides a sense of urgency because we know where this can go if we don't continue this forward movement. I'll also uplift what you said. And what I said in my opening statement, there has not been a major movement, especially for African American rights in this country, that wasn't accomplished with allyship. We have to have people who see our pain, who feel our pain, and are moved at the ballot box to do something to make sure that there is space for us in this society. And that us now is even more broad. When we talk about Asian Pacific Islanders, when we talk about Jewish people, when we talk about our brothers and sisters in the queer and LGBTQ community who are really squaring the targets these days, along with a lot of others, we have a choice to make. And while we are nonprofit, we are not shy about extending our vocal advocacy for anti-racism into this field. And that's really where this whole call germinates from. But I don't know who wants to get into it. We can talk about kind of this right to vote and how it undergirds the controversy of January 6th. There's these hearings that are going on in Georgia about the fake electors, the big steal, which is the equivalent of the lost cause that we used to take on, that we just talked about a moment ago. Can we talk about this false perception without evidence of criminality in the vote, how that tends to target African Americans, and how in some people's minds it justifies some of the legislation that we see come to play here in the state of Florida?
I would like to jump in a little bit. And one of the things that the League brings out and that I bring out when I hear that, and you hear it from time to time, I always try to have civil conversation, regardless of what the person is saying, because sometimes they can be reached. And I say, well, you understand that former President Trump, he won the state of Florida, correct? Oh yeah, we won. I say, and you understand that Governor DeSantis and then Secretary Lee all looked at the results and said everything was fine. There was almost no fraud and it worked well. Well, I said, but if you're insisting that there's fraud, then maybe the former President Trump didn't win. And that kind of slows him down, because just bring it to Florida. We live in Florida, And not only do the other states not have evidence, but the person that many of these people wanted to win, they won. So it's absolutely illogical for them to say, I don't believe in the vote, because then you get them to say, well, then you want to undo the fact that former President Trump won Florida. Oh, no, no, no. See, they kind of get confused. You just got to keep it real and keep it basic. And I've had a lot of them just get stumped because they want to accept what they want to accept. And right there, you force them to kind of look at that. It's like, don't bring me other states' issues. I'm talking about Florida. If you are insisting that there was a problem that we need to spend millions of dollars for Senate Bill 524 with this election police and all the other things they're trying to put out there to scare people and potentially threaten people, then maybe we need to relook at the things that you thought were going on in the other election. If you don't trust your own governor and your own secretary of state, both of them Republicans, and they said it was fine. So I just kind of like break it down like that.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to get in there?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate Cecile for taking the logic approach, because it allows me to talk about how illogical some of these concepts are, and really kind of like, and let's address the why people believe that the election was stolen, right? It's this idea that too many Black and brown people went out to vote, right? And I need people to kind of like center themselves in that this notion of Americanism is steeped in this sort of white nationalist notion that a particular group of people are supposed to determine the outcome of who's in charge of the country. Like, and it's almost like this like acceptance, going back to the election of President Obama, that it was because of the acceptance of the white dominant class that this person ascended to the presidency, and therefore his election is then therefore justified. And therefore the election of Donald Trump in 2016, again, is justified because, the ruling class, if you will, made the determination as to who won. And so what kind of gets under the skin of people as it pertains to 2020 is this idea that, wait a minute, we're out here to make America great again. And so I'm confused as to how these folks in Atlanta, Georgia, or Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Detroit, Michigan, or Arizona, or Phoenix, Arizona, are helping to like shape that. And who are those people? Who are these people that we're talking about that are now kind of turning the democracy that I've always known on its head? And that fallacy is part of the narrative that is being sold to people. And that for me, again, going back to the notion of patriotism, right, is wholly un-American, because at the end of the day, there should be an expectation that anyone who is eligible to vote should be able to cast their ballot. That ballot should be counted, and therefore the execution of an election is done in that way. So it's the double speak that as the young folks say, it's the double speak for me. You know what I'm saying? That you want to talk out of both sides of your mouth, and talk about and pontificate about the higher realms of patriotism and the need to preserve this, preserve that, but the very exercise that everyone should be afforded, irrespective of economic condition, race, gender, etc. If you are, a citizen of this country, you should be able to do this thing, is somehow the disbelief that, oh my God, they went out and did it. And they went out and did it in the midst of a pandemic. I think is kind of like the narrative people want to stress. And so, again, I always want to circle back to the notion of allyship. In this moment, it's like, do it again. Let's do it again and keep doing it. Like, let's show up. Let's do everything we can to kind of uplift the necessity of this exercise of the franchise. But I would take it a step further is that when we pass Amendment 4 in 2018, we also can't make these like random exceptions for people who should also have access to the franchise. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, I'm a whole believer that everyone should have the right to vote, irrespective of what crime they committed. If they served their time, they're deserving of getting the right to vote back. But if what 65% of Floridians passed in 2018 is that people should be able to get their right to vote back with the completion of their sentence, no ifs, ands, or buts, then doggone it, let's make that a reality. And so the idea that people are playing around with that and playing around and creating nouveau poll taxes for certain groups of people, or trying to, again, going back to our trans community, trying to get into a kerfuffle around what is gender identity and what it looks like, that if someone shows up presenting as a woman but their ID says the letter M, that all of a sudden that disqualifies them to vote is preposterous, right? And so it's those kinds of things that really do get under my skin, and where we need greater allyship in the pushback in making sure that people's right to the franchise is fully preserved.
Yeah, and it's and so I think a lot of this is about education, right? Like, really, are you seeing this, and do you have the framework to really understand what's happening here? And you bring some incredible points. I just go back to how sinister and how dastardly these pieces of legislation are. I'm always struck that the playbook is not new. This is the same playbook that was used by white supremacists in the years after Black men earned the right to vote in the 1870s. They were laser focused on creating what we would now call colorblind legislation that did not specifically speak to the fact that we're trying to disenfranchise Negroes, as they would have been called then, but did the desired effect, had the desired effect. It was literacy tests. It was poll taxes, because they knew that they were poor. They knew that they had very high illiteracy rates among African Americans. Felon disenfranchisement, which you just said, after 150 years or more here in the state of Florida, was finally undone in 2018. And then they want to come back to the book again and pull out another form of poll tax to prevent that. I'd like to lift up two of the more egregious pieces of legislation, one that didn't pass, one that did. And one is just pointing out that, and really drawing a line about the retribution that we see. There was an attempt to pass a law that would have increased the threshold by which our state constitution could be amended. All right, and that was, a direct attack at something that was successful, at something that expanded our democracy, which, as you said, Senator Ballot, should be something that all, freedom-loving Americans can embrace. But somehow that was made controversial. It failed this go around. I'm sure we're going to see that again. The other thing, and it was mentioned here earlier by Cecile, is Senate Bill 524, which is very concerning to me. It created the Division of Election Crimes and investigation election crimes, along with a force that is under the auspices of the Department of State. Again, nothing new. It is nothing new in the state or in this country to attempt to intimidate minority voters at the poll. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in there and talk about these or any other pieces of legislation. I know, Cecile, you've already kind of taken us there a little bit. Dwight, if you can come in briefly, and then, because you jump right in it, and then we'll come to, I see Cecile. I want to give some room at some point for Ronnie and Carrie to get back into the conversation as well. But Dwight?
No, I just want to leave folks with this. I mean, for anybody who espouses the notion that they don't like big government, to create an election police force, when study after study has shown that less than 1% of all the votes that are cast are fraudulent, clearly doesn't stand by their word on the size of government, because that is creating an answer to a problem that does not exist, right? So you've created a brand new government agency to specifically figure out where fraud is when there hasn't been any. And again, by the governor's own admission, as Cecile so eloquently pointed out earlier, is that everything went smoothly in 2020, yet somehow we now have a new government agency. To what unsmooth smoothness is beyond me. So I just kind of want to leave that for people to percolate on.
So creating, you know, a whole police force where there is no crime, and then shutting down Souls to the Polls, which is working beautifully to the operation of our democracy. Make it make sense. Cecile?
There are other things that they took away too that people should know about, and we should make sure the community hears more about it. And that is limiting the use of drop boxes. They now call them some sort of secured box or something like that. But what we know is drop boxes. They now have to be only utilized during the business hours that the supervisor of elections office is open, which is a very impactful to a lot of people who work multiple jobs, shift work, and people with generational responsibilities, multi-generational, which targets a lot of African Americans. Because I use the Dropbox, I used to use it all the time because I leave office late and drop it in there and have no problem. But so these things people need to know. The drop boxes are not going to be available 24/7 the way they used to be. You're going to have to go in and drop it in, or request your ballot as early as you can. You can also pick up an absentee ballot and turn it in yourself before 7 o'clock on election day. But people just need to know that. The other thing that they made it more difficult is before it was perfectly lawful if you were not paid any compensation. And this was a common practice in many churches where large times the disabled and elderly would bring their ballots that would have been completed and turn them into a deacon or somebody very responsible in the church, who would then transport them to the polls on time, turn them in on time. That's been taken away. The law now says if you possess more than 2 ballots of other people that are not your family, that is a felony. So, I mean, talk about criminalizing something that there was no problem. But they, again, what Judge Walker said, after getting evidence, he got the representatives and congressmen in the depositions, he got their testimony, and they were asked, did you ask how different races and different demographics voted? They said, yes, we know how Black people, they literally admitted, we found out how different groups voted. And every time the studies, when Black people would increase, whatever was the increase, that was what they put the laws on, and they made the changes and they tightened it. It's, Judge Walker said, you do it once, bad. Twice, terrible coincidence. 3 and 4 times, right on the head. I find that intentional. And I find that's been going on for over 20 years. And he said, it's not because necessarily Republicans hate Black skin, Black and brown skin. They just understand the correlation, heavy correlation with Black and brown picking a certain party, and they want to maintain power. So these are things that have been analyzed. They've admitted to many of these things going on in terms of using that information in a different way. So that's on the table, and that order should be read well, and look particularly at page 65 and 32, where he discusses some of this in that particular order. The other thing that I think is so powerful and telling is the few cases that we know of fraud in elections. There was a lawyer in my town, I know him. This was all on MSNBC. He literally stood up and told people in North Florida, my town, to vote here and then go across into Georgia and use his brother's address to vote again. This is a lawyer. Was any action taken? This is a known problem. As far as I know, nothing has been done. And they're pointing fingers, but they don't want to look at that. The people who changed the addresses down south, I mean addresses, the party.
The party affiliation. Yes, I was going to bring it up. Could you speak about it?
they were Republican activists who did that. Again, when it's happening, look where it's happening. Has there been any action? That makes you realize, again, it's not really we want to stamp out fraud, because there are examples that they are not addressing. And the laws that they pass don't target that, the known ones. So anyway,
I think
he covered it well.
Yeah, I wanna just uplift, because I can't, I really want to leave people with this phenomena of policy violence. You bring up the fact that the deacon taking the ballots to the church for the deaconesses and the mothers of the church is now criminalized, and is a felony now. I would also point out that there have been increased in the fines, right? Like, didn't it go from
Yes.
$1,000 to something like $50,000?
For third-party voter registration organizations. And those are entities that are required to register with the state, give all your information, and you become a third-party voter registrant when you actually take possession of a paper ballot. So, which we do, and many African-American communities and brown communities rely on that. So the limit on the financial fines per year for those organizations was $1,000, which is steep. It is now, after Senate Bill 524, $50,000. And the league is very, very concerned that many smaller organizations are going to be terrified to register voters in communities that they have access to. And it certainly concerns the league.
It's been and this is not our first go around. There was a round of legislation a few years back that had a similar effect. It's to the point I've never entertained touching ballots or registering people to vote, because I just was so fearful of the repercussions of being accused of doing something wrong when I just was attempting to register people, especially on the college campuses where I've been. I've always invited in those third party folks, and just been so grateful for the work that they do. But just to see this intentionality around trying to penalize this very good work that folks are doing, it's just a shame. Gwen in the chat is bringing up the Miami mayoral race between Joe Carrillo and Xavier Suarez that was thrown out because of absentee ballot fraud. So we have many examples there of how this can go wrong. I want to pivot. I do want to pivot and talk about something that is playing out right before us. We've talked a lot about the experience of people of African descent, but women now are facing a real threat with this U.S. Supreme Court decision written by Justice Samuel Alito that's come down that has overturned Roe versus Wade. These states, Republican states like our own, were ready. They had already put in a 15-week ban on abortion. We've heard that our governor wants to expand that. Was something that was triggered for me when you were speaking also, Cecile. He's also hinted that he wants that Republican supermajority in our state. Carrie, I want to come to you and have you really talk to our audience tonight about the threat that's embodied there and the need for allyship on this issue as well.
Yeah, and I just first really want to say how humbled I am to be in the space with you all, and that just to name that I come to all of this through allyship as an ally in the movement. And it's not just about empathy. I always say it's empathy plus, it's empathy, but it's also, this realization, which I learned from Black women and Black people in the movement, that our liberation is bound in one another. And that's how I think how you sustain your allyship, right? By really understanding that we're all in this together. So I'd love to give you my perspective as sort of like an activist and an ally about the fall of Roe v. Wade, which, as you mentioned, came through a Supreme Court opinion, majority opinion written by Justice Alito. And it was, really, really dark, that language, sort of hearkening back to like the 19th century, for me, really evoking imagery of like horse-drawn carriages and corsets, but in like a very creepy celebratory way, right? And sort of signaling to all folks who may have not been considered fully part of society or considered full people back then, that, which is a lot of us, that we may be in real trouble, right? There was certainly language that, hinted that, all of these unenumerated rights that we've identified over the years, all of these rights that may not have expressly been written into the Constitution, that we've deemed the Constitution to protect, that, we had gotten that all wrong, right? And this idea that, whether it's through, under the, when we talk about rights that aren't expressly in the Constitution, whether it's under privacy or equal protection, this idea that there should be more sort of, and so, much bigger than just abortion, right? In that opinion, they're signaling that, that there should be this sort of more strict interpretation of the Constitution, which we know if we go that way, we're in great danger, right? And so, in Florida, I think that, and I know a lot of states probably have this similar mindset because of what's going on in other states, is in Florida, the fall of Roe sort of came alongside with all these other horrors, all these other attacks on civil rights, whether that be the way that anti-Black racism was showing up through what you all have been talking about, the attack on voting rights, the attack on protest, right? The attacks on education, on the acknowledgement of systemic racism, or on our LGBTQ community, especially our gender diverse kids, right? It almost seemed like the fall of Roe was like the headliner in like a big band show, right? Like it's almost like the Lollapalooza of civil rights infringements, right? And so it was really, I say that to say it was kind of, the opinion itself felt a lot bigger than just abortion rights, right? Because of that language. But, in particular with abortion in Florida, we do have a state constitutional right to privacy, which is this additional layer of protection. However, if in November our state legislature isn't, drastically shaken up, they will try to legislate over that state protected privacy right. And just like you mentioned, the 15-week abortion ban is tied up in the courts, that will ultimately end up in the courts. And, it's worth mentioning for folks that may not realize it or may not know, that 15-week ban has no exception for rape or incest or human trafficking. But just like that's going through the courts now, so will, more extreme bans, a complete ban to abortion, if that's legislated, will end up in the courts as a challenge to our state protected right to privacy. And, just speaking of how important the courts are and how important their role is, we learned in the last couple of days that a court of appeal upheld a trial level court's opinion that disallowed a 16-year-old girl to have an abortion based on the parental consent law that passed in 2020, right? And so that impact of forcing a 16-year-old, and she was only at 10 weeks. And so that, and that kind of, that's really just, violence. I mean, not allowing, just criminalizing abortion is violence, right? Forced pregnancy and forced birth is violence. And so, just to put a fine point on how important the courts are for this abortion issue, right? And just making sure people realize, justices, state judges are on our ballots in August, this month, in a few days, right? I keep saying that, but it's coming up real quick. The trial level courts, the county and circuit courts are on our ballot. And in November, the retention of the District Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court justices are on our ballot. And 5 of those Supreme Court justices are up for retention. So just really important for folks to understand, like, the direct connection between those retention races and the right to abortion in Florida, because that's where this fight, that's where this struggle is going to end, in the courts.
There's a question in the chat that's intriguing. I will say that my knee-jerk reaction is not to mix comparisons between chattel slavery as it existed in the United States and the new debates we're having about women's rights and abortion. But one of our viewers, Gwen, has asked, could women's reproductive rights be challenged as violations of the 13th Amendment? And you said something there that kind of brought that in terms of bodily autonomy. I wanted to hear from the lawyers here. How would you respond to Gwen's question?
I think people are looking at every way proponents of women's rights in to attack it, and I think that could be something that could be utilized in that way. I don't know all the history and legislative history of the 13th Amendment, if there were statements made that would go against that argument. I really am hopeful that the Constitution, our Florida Constitution, will hold, and the analysis of our Florida Constitution, our right to privacy, because really what the overturning of Roe v. Wade, it supposedly says, let the states decide. So selfishly, just looking at what's going on in Florida, we have something in our Constitution that was interpreted to give us that protection, so that would be the first place I think people would put their weight on. But I've been talking with people who this is what they do, and they are looking hard and long for the good arguments. And I'll make sure if I talk with anybody, I'll say, hey, what about that one? I'm sure they're looking at it already. But yeah, it's just, we need to bolster, and we need to look at the tools that were used in Kansas when the citizens said, no, you cannot tinker with our protections. And I believe their law was much more explicit about protections and privacy and who had a right to what. And ours is not quite hitting on the head the same way, but we can learn.
Thank you. Carrie, did you have anything to add to that? Okay. Got a few more comments here. Doug, who is talking about this case with a 16-year-old who I heard about that case that the judge said that she was not mature enough to decide whether or not she wanted to become a mother at the age of 16. Very interesting times in which we live, and Gatsby points out that a 15-year-old criminally is old enough to be charged as an adult. Right.
And something else about that case, and I used to, before we had parental consent, we had parental notice. That was the law before, the consent was sort of an extra layer. And as I'm a lawyer, I'm not a criminal civil rights, but as a pro bono sort of side thing, I used to represent, pregnant youth for judicial bypass cases. And what this young girl said, or this young woman said that I read about in the article, was similar to what all these teenagers were saying, that in a very mature way, that they were still in school, and they didn't have support from the father or whoever, and they didn't have the money, they didn't have the resources, they were still in school, and they simply were not ready to have a baby. So this person said similar things in a very mature way. And I think there was an even acknowledgement by the judge that she seemed mature enough. So this idea that, yes, she's not mature enough to make this decision, but she's mature enough to become a parent. And the other interesting thing about this case was that it wasn't where she had parents that were disallowing it and not giving their consent. They I don't think this is too politically correct, but they identify her as like parentless. But I also read she had an appointed guardian. I guess maybe the appointed guardian wasn't the legal guardian, but it was even more frustrating to read that she just really didn't have anybody to give her consent, I guess. And they were taking advantage of that, in my view, to prevent this abortion from going forward. And she certainly seemed mature enough in her testimony and her statements to make this decision. She was making it for the right reasons.
Yeah, that's you said something about forced birth. I think that is that's something to really contemplate. Do we want to live in that society? And I have to say too, through the lens of intersectionality, as a Black woman, when you look at the rates of maternal mortality for Black women and infant mortality in our community, how can you have the one without having more supports for families. Black women have led the charge for decades for reproductive justice. Don't just care about my fetus, care about families, care about children, create, things like, free childcare and things that would make our society more friendly for people who want to be parents. But those things tend to be disconnected. I'm also really struck by what was stated by a Mississippi legislature when taking the task about those maternal mortality rates in his state for Black women. He basically said, if you take the Black women out of the equation, we're not doing so bad. So again, you have to really train your ear and your eyes to look at this stuff, because they're saying it out loud sometimes. A lot of the times it's still the dog whistles. But for those of us who believe in diversity and inclusion and equity in the society, we have to be vigilant, and we have to use every tool at our disposal. And we're here to argue tonight that the ballot box is one of those places. I want to give some space to Ronnie, because Ronnie has an example of leadership and what allyship at the ballot box can look like and how it can change a community. Ronnie, you want to talk a little bit about the founding of this organization and what you've seen come to bear in your community of Miami Shores?
Yeah. As you know, South Florida People of Color, we formed back in 2015, right? And it really wasn't what we're doing now. It was, in response for equitable political representation in Miami Shores. So I don't know if you know Miami Shores, but it's a small town, about 11,000 folks. And so the issue there was, as the US in general, the leadership, the mayor, the people who run the place and the boards were majority white or white presenting Latinx folks. And so we discovered that in Miami Shores, people of color was over 50%. So we wanted to at least have some participation with people of color. So we got the folks together, not all 50% of them, but and what we were trying to do was get them more involved. But we found that there were barriers, as normal, there were barriers where, these positions were basically volunteer jobs. You'll get $1 a year, but people will spend $40,000, $50,000 to get those jobs. Volunteer jobs, let's say. So our solution was to kind of mobilize, folks from racial, ethnic, and cultural folks. I always say divide. And so we started having community dialogues, training, cultural events. And it was, again, a diverse set of folks to have these conversations. And I remember in 2016, that's when we had our first Black History Month, and that's where we invited Dr. Hobbs, 2016, to have a book discussion. And we did have lots of folks from the community, majority white folks from the community. It was very successful, and people want to talk about this stuff, to understand, the shared language, to understand, so they can, have these conversations. And so, as a result, we had several programs that were formed from that, our award-winning Awkward Dinners, our award-winning Unit 360 Community Race Dialogues, our Critical Race Film Series, and of course our cultural events where we did Black History Month, Latinx Heritage Month, Haitian Heritage as well. What was about the program is that, we had these authentic conversations that led to, relationship building basically and healing. And, we do a lot of storytelling, which we feel that helps create a more deep and meaningful connection. So as a result of that, saying really in 2016 with some of the programming. So as a result, in 2019, we got our first Black female mayor after, 87 years, right? And, that's kind of like a 2-year kind of thing. And then we have our second Black woman mayor as well. And then we also, we were able to elect our first Black Haitian woman on council. So the council is the mayor and 4 additional people, right? So we have 3 Black women on our council out of 5. And, what I think is interesting, because it was all white. We also hired a Black Jamaican man. I'm trying to be diverse here because it's, you know, this diaspora is diverse. And then we also have a vice village manager also, that's a Black Jamaican woman. You know, maybe it's because it's just women that makes it, no, let me stop. But anyway, this is like, so to me, that's a great example. And it all comes from experiential education, authentic conversation, storytelling. It is powerful. You know, it gets you on the journey, but, you know, it didn't happen overnight, right? But, you know, we got to keep on keeping it moving, right?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there is that it came from anti-racist allyship at the ballot box, that people could see beyond race, look at the issues, you know, evaluate leaders based on their capacity, and you have evidence of real change. So I always think about that story and think about that impact, and it's just such a credit to you and your leadership. So I put in the chat a note to everyone. We are running out of time. I want to thank you so much for being here this evening. If you have any final questions or comments, do add those to the chat. Carolyn Barr, my good buddy, good to be in the space with you virtually. She was commending us on offering this educational resource, because in order to really stand in the allyship, you have to have information. And we hope that something that you've heard this evening has been edifying for you. But we wanted to leave with our call for action, and you're going to hear it tonight and continue to see it on our social media streams. If you're not following us, please do follow us either on Facebook or on Instagram at SFPoC, South Florida People of Color, so you can see some more of this and explore some more of this. But I wanted to share with you a slide. These are some critical questions that we are asking for our allies at the ballot box to consider as they are going to cast their ballot or to fill out that return mail ballot. If we can get that slide on the screen, that'd be great. But I placed them in the chat in case anybody wants to copy and paste them. Just what I would say is use a lens of anti-racism. As you're evaluating the folks that are on your ballot, has this candidate made statements or supported positions that are harmful to systemically excluded groups of people? Will this policy or platform cause harm to systemically excluded people? Is this candidate or policy supported by an individual or organization like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, who we know are white supremacists and white nationalists and have been internationally recognized, if not here in the United States, as terroristic organizations? If those groups are supporting your candidate, we are asking you in the spirit of allyship to think a little bit more carefully and to consider making a different choice that will align with your values. And that draws to another very important point that we want to make sure that we make, and this is an extension of the trainings that we offer, is that it's not good enough just to sit back on your laurels and think that you are a good person just because you're not, you know, using racist language or you're not actively harming people. But, you know, we need active anti-racists. We need people with skin in the game. We need people who are going to show up where it counts. And it really counts at the ballot box to be allies for folks and to work towards the change that you say you want. It's one thing to be in the streets protesting, and like we were in 2020, in allyship, because you can see the harm and you can see the pain of people, but can you translate that into support at the ballot box as well? Those are the questions that we are asking. Those are the things that are motivating this conversation tonight. We need you to stand with us. We know history teaches us that the movement that we need in this moment cannot take place unless we have allies who are going to stand with us. And I go back to what Carrie said, we're all in this together. And while we have consistently uplifted, you know, the problems of anti-Blackness, we stand as allies with our folks in the LGBTQ community, and want to make sure that we have alignment with them or anyone who is being marginalized in our society. So I do see some questions. Doug is here. I see his question says, how about the endorsement from the Christian Family Coalition as one of the judges has running? That sounds like a local race there. So that's an important twist to those questions. Who's endorsed these people? And are those endorsers, are those organizations actively working to suppress, repress, or marginalize groups of folks? But you'll be seeing more of this. And I would also extend not only an offer for you to follow us on social media, but if you believe in this cause and something we've said tonight resonates in you, we do want you to consider becoming a member of the South Florida People of Color. You can become an annual member, a sustaining member. In this climate that we're living in right now, where our work has literally been criminalized, if we make people uncomfortable with the very necessary conversations that we were founded to have, we could be taken to court. And as Ronnie pointed out, as our executive director, it has slowed our business. But we know now more than ever, the conversations that we're leading are very necessary. And so your membership is going to allow us to continue to operate, to raise our voice and expand so that we can create that more inclusive future for all Floridians and all citizens here in the United States of America. With that, any closing comments from our panelists? Let's go around. Carrie, we'll start with you.
Yeah, no, just going back to, allyship at the ballot box and anti-racism at the ballot box, and some of them have been mentioned in the chat. Definitely encourage folks to, go to the organizations that you trust, who represent your community, and there's a lot of information out there. There are voter guides out there. I think Dwight mentioned there's the Florida for All voter guide, which is a statewide voter guide. I've seen the Florida Rising voter guide. There's, I think, a SAVE. We mentioned our LGBTQ community, and SAVE absolutely has anti-racist practices as well. They have a statewide voter guide out. Engage has a. So just to really encourage you to search out those endorsements and those voter guides when you go to the ballot box, if you have not already, because there's a ton of information out there that you can dig into. Just be educated, right? To be anti-racist.
Thank you. Cecile?
Yes. Basically, voting touches everything. So we got to get involved and we got to educate ourselves. And most of us have people that we love, issues that we care about, family members, or just, there's always something. You could be a lover of animals or trees or whatever it is that stirs your heart. There are politicians and people in power that we vote for that make decisions on how those things are being treated. So that's just the message we should share. And I also wanted to mention the League does have a program where we've trained pro bono lawyers and they can take 2 CLEs, and the continuing legal education programs are free. And we ask the lawyers who take them, it's on our website, ask the lawyers who take them to offer pro bono services to returning citizens, persons with felony convictions, because there's been some confusion for some of them. Did they complete their sentence or not? Is there any fines and fees, which is the law as it stands? And we don't agree with that, but we don't want anybody being prosecuted. And there've been, unfortunately, some new cases with that. So I'm gonna just put it right there. I think that's for everybody. That is our dedicated number. And we have a dedicated email. And people can, if you know anybody that has any concerns, or you can direct them to that. And we are referring lawyers who sometimes just looking at their documents gives the answer. Sometimes there's a need to go to court. So we just want to make sure we spread that information as far as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. That's amazing work. Dwight, and then we're going to close out with Ronnie.
Yeah, just a friendly reminder, gentle reminder that you're smarter oftentimes than you give yourself credit for when it comes to things like this. For whatever reason, people feel a sense of intimidation when it comes to voting or exercising the franchise, that yes, the decision you're making is weighty and it should be taken seriously, but at the same time, the same kind of unique ways that we find out information in this world are the ways we find out information about the very people that you're voting for, right? They have social media, they have websites. Organizations like the ones on this call are going to be putting on forums or providing information on where you can actually interact with these people in real time. And so we have to be as diligent about this as we are about the Real Housewives of Atlanta or Miami or any place else, right? And just understand that people are making significant decisions about your everyday well-being, and oftentimes with very few or a small percentage that you can imagine making that decision. Someone brought up in the chat the city of Miami, their last election boiled down to 12% of the total population voting in that election. What you think about that? It's our largest city in Miami-Dade County, and 12% of the people who are eligible to vote or cast a ballot for the commissioners in that space. We're in the midst of a midterm primary election. I know a lot of folks focusing on November 8th, but the turnout for the August primaries tend to be somewhere around 20%, even though 100% of the registered voters are eligible to vote in a primary, despite whatever misinformation you hear. Yes, there are partisan races on that ballot, but there are a slew of nonpartisan races that everyone's eligible to vote in. Judges, school board members, county commissioners, and so I just want to encourage folks to be, again, diligent in making a plan to vote, how to vote, and who to vote for, and get to know these folks and get engaged. And if you need help, there are support systems out here, whether it's the League, whether it's Women's March Florida, Florida Rising, or of course, South Florida People of Color. We encourage you to check us out, join us, be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. But look forward to seeing y'all around South Florida and the rest of Florida.
I love it. I want to thank the panelists. I mean, you guys were great. Carrie, Senator Dwight Bullard, Cecile, of course, Dr. Tamika Hobbs as well. And I don't know what else to say. I mean, you guys said it all. I mean, voting is important. It's the first start, right? Because I do have young people come to me and we're like, they don't really think, why should I bother? And I think just listening to, this webinar really defines why you should. And, but it's, it's the first start too. I mean, we get folks, we vote folks in and then we feel like they're not, doing stuff that we want them to do. So we have to make them accountable for that. And that's protesting, that's, writing to them and, all different types of things we can do. So it's a start, but, I really appreciate the panelists and let me give it back to Dr. Hobbs because I know she has some words of wisdom to close it out.
I think I said everything I wanted to say, and I always surround myself with people that are a little smarter than me, so they can handle all that. I just want to send out some sincere thank yous. I want to shout out Sarah Prato, who in our volunteers meeting, when I brought this up, was the brave soul who said, yeah, I'll help you with that. And over the last several months, she's helped me. She's helped me to ideate about who to invite. Done research that'll end up in some of our research guides and our webpage to support this campaign. So Sarah, thank you for all of your thought partnership, your work, and for being here tonight. I want to shout out another one of our board members, Kathleen Fisher. I want to thank her for everything she does and has done over the years to stand up this organization. I see some of our members and volunteers, Doug, Carolyn, we heard to them, Gwen is here, Jay, who works with and leads the Unity 360 Institute is here. Thank you all for what you do. I see Doug has his hand up. Doug, you got a hand?
Yeah, I think that was from the beginning. He was trying.
Oh, okay. Well, we appreciate him for being here. And I don't know, there was some conversation that we might do this again. We barely touched on everything that we laid out. And the way things have worked out, there's always something new that's happening. So don't be surprised if you see another announcement about another panel, so that we can continue to educate people, continue to mobilize people, so that we can do the work that we need to do, those of us who believe in freedom in this state. With that, thanks everyone. Thanks to our producer, Adam Stone, behind the scenes, keeping us straight. And look out for more from the South Florida people of color. Be well.
Thank you.